Can a movie cause civil war? What effect, if any, does entertainment have on us? Also, if you want your streaming platform to look more like cable TV, you're in luck. And if you're done watching movies altogether, Daniel may or may not have a good book recommendation for you. All this and more on this week's episode of Faith and Pop Culture.
Hey, well, what's up, everyone? Welcome to episode number 6 of the Faith and Pop Culture podcast. It is me, your host, Daniel, and I am joined, as I always am, by the Q-tip to my earwax, Mr. Samuel David Camp. What is up?
Not much. That's quite the picture there. But there's nothing better than a freshly cleaned ear.
Are you like an obsessive Q-tipper like I am?
Yeah, I'm pretty obsessive about that.
Like, are you? I'm not saying I do this, but like, do you keep some like on your nightstand by your bed and some in your office and
No,
wherever you might be?
no,
the urge.
it's definitely not to that degree.
Yeah, me neither. I've heard some people do that,
But there are those out there who have that.
but yeah, it is. There's nothing that feels better than just cleaning out that ear. But also, what feels good is talking about faith and pop culture every week. There's been a lot going on this week, just stories and just personal stuff. This has been a busy week for us. There's always a lot going on, but we're excited each week to just pause, step back from the chaos and just discuss what's going on, try and look at, pop culture through the lens of faith and kind of what scripture, might have to say and inform us about that. And this week is no different because there's several interesting things that I thought we could get into that I think are, they're both timely, they're topical, but I think also just some general principles and stuff about how do we engage in this crazy pop culture, jungle that we live in. And kind of the first one of those topics is just how do movies affect us? Like how, because that seems like a very simple question, but I think it can be more complicated than that. And I think there's been some stuff this week that have sort of raised that evergreen question again and kind of given it some, some flesh, some immediate stuff. And in the form of some recent movies. So kind of the biggest movie that just came out is Civil War. This has sort of been a pretty buzzworthy movie that, it's no mistake that this movie is dropping, I think, in an election year. This is the type of movie that is designed to sort of...
Rather on the nose.
Yeah, it's not... It is many things. Subtle is not necessarily one of those things. But it is a movie that has garnered a lot of buzz. Because, again, if you're not familiar with the film... This is like essentially imagining an American Civil War if it happened like 3 years in the future or like today. It's a modern, you have...
What would a modern Civil War look like?
Yeah, and it's,
in America.
This is like an R-rated, it's a pretty serious film. It's violent, it's intentionally kind of, supposed to be disturbing or unsettling, perhaps. And it's obviously sparked a lot of different opinions, but one of those opinions is fear and outrage. The classics that come with a lot of
One of our favorites.
One of America's go-to emotions when it comes to entertainment. For example, like there's an article in the Hollywood Reporter, which sort of talked like right before this movie came out, which was kind of doing some surveys, like some different quotes and stuff from people saying, like, hey, we know that this is a fictional movie, but like, what if it, inspires? Like, what if it leads to the very thing that it's trying to, warn us about? And like, what if people don't know the difference? And it actually, they watch this movie and think, hey, that looks kind of cool. That looks kind of fun to, fight and defeat your political enemies. And there's been a lot of articles like that, like leading up to this movie of like, is it good to have a movie like this? Or is this movie gonna like cause the very thing that we're concerned about? And even there's been some other kind of recent conversations, like the new Joker movie, around this similar theme. So I thought we could get into that a little bit. Like, is there any validity to some of these kind of concerns about like, hey, what happened? Can movies sort of, like, is there a cause and effect of like, you see this thing and it portrays this? Do we need to, as Christians or just as humans, need to be concerned about like reality shaping fiction. What are some of your thoughts for
Yeah.
this?
I mean, I think most of the sort of articles that you allude to, and I think a lot of the fears that people have when it comes to um, movies like this having some sort of superpower over the general public, and like, you know, if this movie goes out and a lot of people see it, and you know, it may actually lead to civil war, I think is very overblown. And I think the cause and effect is much harder to um, correlate, to say with certainty, like, hey, you know, this movie comes out, you know, we're going to see an uptick in violence and rhetoric about secession from the Union, or whatever. So I think in that regard, it's much to do about nothing. But I think maybe over time, I think the more concerning thing would be the exposures of ideology in entertainment over a long period of time. I don't think you can like look at any one particular movie and be like, hey, this movie's dangerous and it shouldn't be watched, and so like let's try and like ban it, or you know, just, you know, not engage with it because it's so serious. And it's like that, like I don't think people operate that way. Like,
Yeah, it's sort of like how much power do you give to one movie or one book or one song or whatever it is to, because there is no question. I don't think anyone would, any informed person would disagree that like entertainment affects us. Like
yeah,
it's not nothing. Like we're not neutral. That it's just like what we watch, what we fill our minds with, the stories, the images that we see, and like that does impact us in
yeah,
various, very real and like important ways. I think the question is more like kind of how does it impact us, right? To what degree, or like how do you sort of like the follow up to that, which is a discussion that's been going on like forever, like because this
yeah,
is a like far predating movies, and kind of like you can trace this idea back even to like the ancient Greeks, like kind of the, for those of you that aren't haven't studied a lot of like philosophy or read much of that, like you sort of have these polarized opinions of like Plato, who just he had a very low view of like the theater and like poets and stuff, and sort of his argument was just like, hey, it inflames our passions, like you see violence and that inflames violence in you, and then you want to leave the theater and go beat someone up and like, commit violence, or whatever it might be. Where like Aristotle, like his student, kind of countered that and saying like, actually no, like the theater does the opposite. Like you already have, like, we're violent people, we have these emotions, like,
yeah,
so you go to a theater and you see uprising and war, and you see these things portrayed like in theater, and like he called it catharsis, like it actually purges you
yeah,
of these emotions. Then you can leave the theater and it's like, well, you've dealt with these emotions that we already have. You've just done it instead of going to beat up your neighbor, like you've watched warfare, and like it's kind of got you
yeah,
out. And it's funny that like that's the ancient Greeks, but like that's still sort of the debate, like sort of
yeah,
who was. And I think the reason we still debate it is because like they're kind of both right, like in a sense. Like I don't think it's an
yeah.
easy, one of them was right, one of them was wrong. Like I think entertainment and stories can kind of do both of those things.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think it's just it's tough to know to what degree, and I think that's why the debate rages on all these centuries later, is because it's like, well, you know, you can see how both are correct, and it's a matter, I guess, of degree, and and just to see how, like, how does that play out, and I guess it ultimately comes back down to like your own personal take on it. But I think we're far less malleable maybe than media outlets would have you believe, that like you can just sort of be tricked into starting a civil war based on a movie, which kind of seems like absurd on its face. But you can also see how, well, there is so much civil unrest, and there is so much outrage, and like so many people are discontented, and it's like, well, is this the spark that ignites the flame, sort of. Like you can easily see how you could think that. um Again, we're sort of referencing civil war, but I think in general, um I think it's, and it's interesting too that it's always sort of based on like violent movies. Like there was all of that debate with the Joker. Like when it came out, like everyone was like, oh well, now you're gonna have all these people, like you get inside the mind of the Joker and you're gonna spawn all these other Jokers.
Well, I think
like
it's because it's such an easy like it's an easy connection to make. Like
yeah,
violence happens, and you need to explain where that came from, and like the easiest thing to do is just to point to like,
yeah,
well, did he play Call of Duty? Like, did he play a violent video game? Like,
yeah.
if he did, then you have this easy causality, which
Well, and there may be a correlation, but I don't think anyone has been able to show causality, and I think that's the difference, because there's always, like, every year or two there's like a big stir about violent video games causing violence, and yet all of the data suggests that that's not the case.
yeah,
Violent video games don't
the
cause.
narrative doesn't matter. And there's actually an interesting there's a book that I recently read. If you're watching our video version, you can see it. Of You Are What You Watch, and this is by author Walt Hickey, who's like he won previously like a Pulitzer Prize, so it's not he's a legitimate sort of data kind of sociologist guy. And in the book, he has an interesting study of trying to like correlate some of that conversation of
Yeah.
do violent movies and also video games like lead causality to like acts of violence. And he cites a bunch of studies that were done by different universities and like surveying lots of people, and comes to the conclusion that like, it's actually the opposite. Like he takes to go back to like the Greeks, like he takes sort of the data points more towards Aristotle, whereas he's saying, you have a lot of these violent, these, like he said, most acts of violence happen by people that are young and they're male and they're often drunk. Like that's the majority. They're not the only ones, but like that's where the majority of like violent acts come from. And he said, like, what movies do, it's violent movies, they give you that thrill, like they sort of satisfy some of that itch, but like they also keep you contained on a Saturday night in a place where you can't have alcohol. Like it sort of, it allows you to wrestle with those emotions in a way that is healthier. Like it is, in the study, they conclude that based on their data, they would estimate that about 52,000 violent assaults each year don't happen because of movies. Like because the people that would commit them are actually like in the theater watching John Wick 4 or whatever. And obviously it's a more complicated discussion, but kind of my takeaway from that is just that I think our perception of how entertainment impacts us is just more nuanced than we sometimes think. Because I think all people, it's not exclusively that only Christians are, overblown. Like the Hollywood Reporter article is in a Christian perspective, and it's making a lot of those assumptions. But I think Christians are prone to that, like where there is a degree of like fear. That, hey, we need to keep our kids. We need to keep Christians from seeing any of these movies. Like if this movie doesn't have a biblical worldview, or like if it has violence or something that like content wise we're not comfortable with, like there's this degree of fear that like we got to avoid that because that's going to change us. Like if we watch Harry Potter, that's going to make us into a witch. Or if we watch like a movie with atheist ideologies, like if we just see that, like this one movie, then like our faith is in jeopardy. Therefore, pull away. Which I just don't think is a healthy. Again, not that we aren't cautious. Like there's things Christians should stay away from. Like almost like you start the conversation with that in mind, but like at a deeper level, I think there is value in some of these stories that actually make us uncomfortable, and I think we can actually navigate that without being in jeopardy of like our whole worldview crumbling.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, and I think like the converse of that is also true, where like and maybe like faith-based film is moving away from this, but also the idea that like this one movie, like everybody needs to see it. Like there's so much emphasis placed on like this one movie that a faith-based company produced, and it's like it is sort of the key to revival in America, or it's going to change lives and communities, and that may be true. Like it may be life-changing for some people, but the idea that like one single film, one show is going to like change everything, I think is also like both like on the negative side, but also on the positive side. Like I think we just tend to overplay the like immediate effects of entertainment. Like in the singular, but underplay it over like a lifetime. Like if you're exposed to a lot of violence or um, maybe not even like behavior, but even just like ideologies over a long period of time, I think that has a greater cumulative effect on how you view the world versus like a singular movie that's very disturbing or very, affirming one way or the other.
Yeah, like, I don't think we always ride the wave very well for like if you like think of like today, the problems, the unbiblical ideologies like that we see in our culture. Like, how many of those can be traced back to like the Da Vinci Code? Like, like
Yeah.
this book that comes out and then later a movie that so much like emphasis by the Christian community on like this is, derailing spirituality in America. And like when's the last time anyone thought of the Da Vinci Code? Like,
Yeah.
like did that one movie, was it like this sort of silver bullet that just like, faith could withstand a lot? The church
Well, if you look
withstood
at
the Roman Empire, but like the
yeah.
Da Vinci Code is what, that's what undid us. Like, no,
Yeah.
like, but I think collectively, when you have various, usually more subtle like ideologies and like that work more on like the emotional level, I think that is when it becomes more impactful, or like more where
Yeah.
Christians need to, like to be more engaged and aware that like we are kind of we do become numb to things that we see in television. Like,
Yeah.
I think less so the ones that are just like yelling, religion's bad and this ideology, like the real overt stuff is easy to kind of ignore. It's more the like there's a little bit here and a little this tugs on your emotion about this here and then this show and then like kind of this wider conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think the Da Vinci Code is a really great movie and book that pertains to this, because I think like if the church's response is that's bad, that's it's blasphemy or whatever, like don't engage with it. Well, then people who do engage with it and have legitimate questions about it aren't going to get those answers from the church because they've just decided we're not partaking of that in any way. But I think if you read the book or watch the movie, there's really like there's nothing in there that is like challenging to your faith, and it's like so the message I think that you send people is like our faith is so fragile that we can't even discuss like this movie that sort of does a fictional narrative based on a few things, that are in, Catholicism or the Bible, or like they pull on a thread that goes this direction. And it's like, that's so damaging that we can't even like look at it. And it's like, well, that's, you certainly don't want that to be the message that you're giving to people. It's like, okay, well, I don't think your faith is that
Well, and I think
shallow.
too, like I think it, like you said, I don't think like that movie is gonna like. I feel like if that movie is enough to like derail your faith, then like the issue is just an immature faith that needs discipleship, and like which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but like it's just I don't think we can just blame this movie if that's all it takes to. But I think as Christians, like if we do sort of this check out of anything that's remotely sort of uncomfortable or challenging, like because we think we're avoiding it, like I think the real impact comes from the way that sort of collectively those sort of things sort of add to this like social consciousness of like they sort of add to this narrative that we kind of the water we swim in, and like these ideologies are prevalent, and now the people around us are sort of they've heard it so much that hey, it must be true because it seems like everyone I see on TV is affirming this lifestyle or this thing. Like not that any one of those shows or movies changed anyone's opinion.
Yeah.
But, like, and that's kind of the problem with as Christians, like if we totally check out because we're so fearful of this, the impact, that we're not actually guarding against what's impactful, because that's still shaping the culture, cultural consciousness. Like I think that's why Christians should be more engaged. And maybe one last thing for this is just I have some gripes to pick about the quote, but you often hear people being like, no, the Bible is R-rated, and I think like on one sense I feel like it's just Christians trying to like, add an edge to the Bible. Like we're so edgy as Christians. Our book is R-rated. Like it's banned in this many countries, and like, no, that doesn't do it.
Yeah.
But I do think that that's not to say that like the Bible doesn't have very harsh content and stuff that makes you uncomfortable. And I think that's probably the strongest argument just for the Christian faith. Like, like you get verses, like Proverbs says, guard your heart because everything comes, everything flows out of it. Like there
Mm-hmm.
is a sense that we very much need to be aware and like protective of what we allow to like filter into our life. But like just the fact that God's kind of, inspired word is filled with uncomfortable stuff suggests that like those two things aren't mutually exclusive. Like,
Yeah.
like we can read violence in the Bible without having to worry that like we're gonna go like, the Israelites conquested, the promised land. Like we need to go do that too, take over. Like we don't need to worry about that
Yeah.
because we have that healthy balance. And like we can handle that content and like read it with the whole the breadth of Scripture. I do think that that sort of gives us not permission in the sense that like how much can we get away with, like how much
Right.
bad stuff, but just that like, it's okay to be uncomfortable and to like deal with harsh realities of life, and like our faith should be able to withstand that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think again it goes back to maybe just the amount of that you have in your life. Like probably if you're just watching a bunch of junk on repeat, like maybe that's not a great way to live, but it's like you can take the occasional movie that challenges your faith or just challenges your worldview or it's uncomfortable. And I also would say like with movies like that, like The Joker, for instance, I think it's also important to be in the right headspace to view it. And I think there are certain movies that are challenging that just take a lot more emotional energy to like sit through and experience. I think, plan to do that as well. Like it's probably not a good idea to be in a bad headspace and just okay, fine, I'll just watch this really tough movie and slog it out. And so I think like plan if you are going to see a movie that's challenging, maybe see it with some friends, whatever, and think about it afterwards and compare it with what you know in scripture or just kind of dissect it a little bit so that you have an understanding of what was the filmmaker trying to do here, like what was happening, and not just sort of like, well, just that's another movie in the in the library, and we're just gonna move on and not ever like consider what you watched. And so I think having one just the amount of uncomfortable films you watch, keep that balance, I think, in mind, but also just who you watch it with, I think, can be very
Yeah, I think
helpful.
it's sort of an intentionality of like,
Yeah.
I think we should be able to be uncomfortable, but movies do affect us. So like,
Yeah.
be intentional with how you engage with that. But hey, if you guys have any thoughts on that, again, send us a message, or if you're watching us on YouTube, jump in the comment section, share. How do you sort of navigate that question of how do movies impact you, and kind of how in your own personal life, how have you sort of safeguarded and also being intentional to watch stuff. One movie that I saw recently that I think was a healthy, unsettling experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not overly so. There was a couple scenes in it that I feel like isn't necessarily something that a lot of my Christians are used to watching. Some violence is Irena's Vow.
Mm-hmm.
This is a World War II story about a Polish nurse that ends up as like the housekeeper of like a Nazi German major, and ends up like sheltering 12 Jews like in his house. Miraculous kind of true story that just came out this week, kind of through limited release of Fathom Events, and then I think it will be eventually on streaming. I know we've sort of talked about the movie itself, I think last week, but I did have the opportunity to chat with some of the people involved in the movie, which I always enjoy doing. This kind of talking to creatives, talking to interesting people. So I thought we'd just play. Again, encourage you to check out the full interviews that we have on our YouTube channel and also our website. But just play a couple clips from these for you guys. The first one, Gianni, who's like the daughter of the real life Irena, and I thought we'd share. So I talked to her, and she shared a bit about just sort of her mother's legacy and like sort of the power of one faithful life to make a difference. So check out this clip.
Thanks. That's a great question. Like you said, my mom was away from home. She had no parents, no family to back her up, no house to go to, nobody. And she was young, but she was able to make a difference. And, my mom ended every talk, and now I do too, stressing that one person can make a difference. We don't have to be any superstar. We don't have to be. She hated if somebody called her a hero, because it puts Well, sure, they can do it. They're a hero or they're an angel or whatever, all the terms that she's been called. That's not true. She's flesh and blood, flawed human being, just like every single one of us are. But yet, she saw opportunity. She had a strong sense of what was right and wrong. And, she walked the walk. She just took one step at a time. I've heard her say that if she would have had a chance to do it over again and not done any of those things, she certainly wouldn't have been gang raped or had all the things that had happened to her. But she said she would have never been able to live with herself, knowing that she could have done something and didn't. So, she appreciated every single day of her life up until the very end.
I also had the opportunity to talk to Dan Gordon, who really is like a pretty prolific screenwriter in Hollywood. I think he wrote the last one of the like Rambo movies, and he wrote a movie, The Hurricane, which featured Denzel Washington in it, in which Washington was like nominated for an Academy Award. I don't think he won, but he was nominated. So he's he's done a bunch of stuff, and he is the screenwriter for this movie, which is based on a Broadway play, which he also wrote. And the whole interview was fascinating, kind of a behind the scenes look. But I did ask him just about what role did Irena's faith play in her story, and I thought his answer was just enlightening. So check out this clip.
Irene had what I've told people was a perfect faith. Now, I've only known one person like that in my entire life, and that was Irene. It was not dogmatic in any way. It wasn't attached to church dogma. It was a very, very personal relationship with God. And if you can imagine a 20-year-old who's charged all of a sudden with saving 12 lives, it wasn't that Irene had a plan. She didn't plan anything out. When the major said, "I want you to be my housekeeper," she immediately went, "I can hide these Jews in the basement of the major's house." Now, that's insane. It's just flat out insane. But her faith in God was so pure that God would see her through this. And it was that strong. And that faith, I don't believe her faith was ever challenged. I think she went through trying circumstances, but it never put a dent in her faith. Her faith, like I say, was almost childlike and innocent, except in a mature adult. And it was a very personal relationship that she had with God, and it was an inspiring faith to be around.
One thing I will say about that interview with Dan Gordon is like he's just a great storyteller. Like I feel like I could have listened to him, like that whole interview that we did. Like if I could just listen to him like tell stories about whatever. For a long time.
He seems like a guy like he has like both he's good at telling stories, and you just get the sense that he has a lot of stories to tell.
Yeah.
Like he's experienced some neat stuff. Like I think he served, which I don't think we ever mentioned in the interview, but like he served as like in some capacity on like the Israeli Defense Force, like in the army, and like, he's also done Broadway plays and movies, and so just an interesting guy. So I encourage you guys again check out the full. They're both like 10, 12-minute interviews, so not like a super long sit down or anything, but I think both worth checking out. And maybe one kind of final thing that just stood out to me this week as far as like pop culture and entertainment is that the days of streaming being kind of unique seems to be changing, and nowadays it seems like sort of this new streaming ecosystem is looking eerily a lot like old school cable TV.
Yeah, it's like I think we've seen this before.
Yeah, there's a little deja vu,
and it was called cable television,
which has already happened with now we're gonna have these streaming platforms, and now we're gonna start bundling these together, and you can subscribe to all these channels.
You get Disney, Hulu, and ESPN.
Yeah, hey, wait a minute. I feel like we used to be able to get all that.
It was like a bundle and save with even more channels.
And kind of continuing on that path of just selling you what you already had just for more money, is Disney Plus. Just recently, it was reported that they're going to launch several 24/7 linear TV channels, complete with commercials, all the stuff we used to love back in the day that led us to cut the cable and cut the cord. But so this is essentially, as far as I understand it, is that they will, obviously they'll still have their streaming platform you got to pay for, and you can select what you want to watch, but they will also give you the option to, pick like a Star Wars channel or a Marvel channel or like a, family film or a classic Disney channel, and like old school cable TV, it's just like it will constantly run. Like you can just turn it on, there'll be commercials, they'll play a movie, and then when one movie ends, another one will, another program will come on, another episode, and so you can just continue watching without any of the work of like selecting what you want to watch.
Well, I think the thing is people underestimate the joy of the serendipity of turning on the TV, not knowing who knows what's playing, and like, oh, it's this movie, great. Like, let's just sit down and watch it. Like, that's what people loved about cable, and then the commercials every 5 minutes, I think was really the thing that that people really remembered about cable. And it's like, why can't we have that again?
Yeah, why do we want choice when we can have not choice? But I do think it's interesting because again, there's lots of ways you can understand this. I think part of it is this is 100% designed to just try and hook people into TV, and like rather than giving you that out of like, well, should I go find a new show? Well, no, I guess I can finish. I've already watched 2 hours of TV. Now it's like you finish a show and hey, there's a new one. Like, don't leave the couch.
Yeah.
Watch more. Like, so I don't think this is like. They're not doing this with our best interest in mind.
Oh, no, no. I mean, I think if anything, this is really more to recapture the glory days of their ad revenue that they had back before they had streaming, because it's like,
yeah, streaming was
they were making tons of money.
Streaming, so you don't have commercials, and now it's like, wait, now you pay for streaming.
Yeah,
and you also get commercials.
Yeah, it turns out paying for streaming is nowhere near the amount of money that they were making when they had advertisers, and so I mean, this is like.
Yeah, now
the streaming model is just
you're paying us, the advertisers are paying us. Like
it's the best of both worlds.
But I do think does this have anything to do with faith? I think not. Not.
Yeah. How does this help?
But hey, this is a faith and pop culture podcast, so we will make it have a connection to faith. I do think it is important. Maybe not important. That's too strong. But I think it's interesting because there's been a shift of like other kind of Amazon and some other streaming platforms have like done similar things. Like Netflix, I think last year, I forget what the feature was called, but they introduced some feature you can turn on where like basically you just let the algorithm, it essentially does the same thing.
Yeah.
The algorithm just chooses what show for you to watch. And like sort of the reasoning for that is that like a lot of people, according to their data, at least at least that's what they're telling us, like are almost like crippled by the amount of options. Like you turn it on, you just have like endless library of shows and movies, and then you have like an endless library now of like different streaming platforms that all have different different types of content, and like there's just so much stuff that people like are struggling to figure out. Like, it's like overwhelming. It's like there's like an anxiety of like, what do I watch now, what do I watch? You just sort of keep flipping through, where like old school TV sort of curate, and this new development kind of curates for you, like, hey, take the stress out. Like, just watch TV. TV shouldn't be stressful. And like, does that mean anything? Like, is there anything to that? Like, I think, because like, I feel like we almost take for granted, because there's so much talk of like streaming, that like that's always been the case. Like, streaming's the normal, which like isn't. Like the idea that you have that much content available and that much entertainment options is like a very, very recent development, like a blip on the radar. Like, we're sort of like the first generation to ever have to deal with that. And things like this, going back to linear TV, almost just suggests that like I don't think humans were meant to have that much recreational entertainment options.
Yeah, I do think it is really mind-boggling and insane, like the amount of options, even on any given platform, any given streaming service, like just the endless list of options that people have. And then you've got on top of that like however many streaming services there are out there. And so I just think it is just insane, the amount of entertainment that has been created like in the last decade or so. And I don't think people are really capable of sort of sifting through that. Like, it's just an overwhelming task. And especially I don't know, this just makes me think that like have a maybe a practical application of this is have a entertainment plan like for yourself. Like, okay, if you're going to watch something with the family on Friday night, know in advance what it is you're going to watch. And I think that can help with a lot of just the anxiety of like choice overload. And I think doing that will just, I think, one, just give you a much better experience, but two, like you end up, I think, watching the things that you want to watch and not just getting overwhelmed and bogged down and then frustrated or whatever happens when, you know, you have way too many options to choose from. And I think, you know, despite living in America and being an American, I think people need fewer choices. Like, I don't think they need as many choices as they think they do. Like, I think we're obsessed with choice. I think especially like in America, but I just don't think people are capable of like just the broad breadth of choices that
Which
they
I think
have.
was the primary argument of Loki as the villain in the first Avengers movie, was that people don't actually want choice. I feel like
Well, I wouldn't say no choice, but I just think fewer choices.
yeah, but I do think I agree with you.
And maybe he was onto something.
Hey, maybe Loki was a good after all. But
Maybe I'll watch it and be inspired to be a supervillain.
yeah, that will lead you. That's what radicalized Sam was watching the Avengers, the first movie. But I did. Obviously, we do a faith and pop culture podcast. Like, we're pro pop culture, pro entertainment, and like we've always had entertainment. Everyone's books in different forms.
Yeah.
But like the amount of stuff, like even just as Christians, like the amount of entertainment we have today is more like it's not the norm for throughout history for like a Christian to watch this ungodly amounts of television every night, like just to sit and watch like 4 hours of Netflix. Like,
Yeah.
that's we've always had we had books, we had theater, we've had movies for the last 100 years. Like, none of that is bad, but I feel like it's because we're so accustomed to it, like we're immersed in it, that it seems normal to us. Like, that's just what everyone does. Like, everyone watches streaming, but like
Yeah.
it's not the normal. Like,
No.
Christians have always had entertainment, but like also a lot of other activities, and like I feel like this is just maybe the tip of the iceberg of a shift that okay, maybe we don't need as much as we think we do. Like,
Yeah.
maybe there's other ways to spend our time other than like like if you need an algorithm to pick a show because you have too much, like I feel like you need to start trimming down.
Yeah.
Like cancel a couple of these subscription things, or like
Right.
just not watch a couple of shows.
I think it goes back to like if your faith is going to be derailed by Da Vinci, the Da Vinci Code movie, maybe the Da Vinci Code movie is not the issue. Like and I think it's the same with this. Like if if you're needing this algorithm to pick your movies, or if you just watch the linear 24/7 Disney Plus channel, then maybe let's take a step back and think about just like your entertainment as a whole, and like you need far less of it than you think you do. And I think that's where Christians can be, hopefully, on the front lines of pushing back against just this sort of over entertainment culture that we have. And just this media saturated, because we're not even getting into like social media and video games, and so like the amount of things that you're engaging with in a passive way, I think is just it's off the charts.
Well, it's unprecedented.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like
Yeah.
we haven't yet even seen the impact of that saturated with entertainment. So I think kind of all the topics we've talked about, like, be intentional with what you watch and what you engage with or listen to or read, but like also just be aware that like the quantity as well of things that we don't need as much as we maybe think we do. And I think we're starting to see some of that. But speaking of more entertainment, if you don't want to be cautious and you want to just see everything that's out, we do have the next segment of our episode. We have Out Now and Coming Soon.
So Daniel, as we mentioned earlier, we've got 2 movies that are out. You've reviewed both of them. Those are up on the channel, and that is Civil War and Irena's Vow. What are your 2 cents? Your Reader's Digest version?
Well, both good. I think both difficult for different ways. Civil War more so than Irena's Vow. It is a violent movie. I enjoyed it, despite the fact that while watching it, my AMC theater had 2 power outages. Delayed the movie for like 30 minutes, and when it came back on, they couldn't find the right place, so they skipped around the movie in real time and missed some stuff. And the second time it came on, they couldn't get the volume to work for the last about 15 minutes of the movie. So the climax was silent. But other than that,
take his review with a grain of salt. Like, it may not be totally complete.
My experience was different, but I don't think it's necessarily a movie that like everyone has to go watch. or that everyone should watch. Like there is some like disturbing imagery. I just found it what I wanted it to be, which is interesting. Like it's one of the few movies that I left and I'm like, oh, I was kind of thinking about that. Like, is it good? Is it bad? Like, I kind of went beyond that of like, I don't really care if it's good or bad. Like, I just think it's interesting. There's some stuff going on, and like
the premise is interesting.
The premise is interesting. Like, the way they depict it is interesting. Like, and even like to see like on social media, just like you have people taking away like completely opposite perspectives on what this movie's trying to say, because we're so used to movies that just like what's the like we almost want the director just to like after the movie come on like, and by the way, like this is what you should think. Like,
in case you missed my heavy-handed implications.
And because it doesn't really take a position, like it more just sparks questions, and it's almost like we don't know what to do with that because we're so used to movies like hammering us over the head.
Man, I think more movies like that is good, and so good on Alex Garland for putting out something.
So I do think so. Again, check out my review if you want to know a little bit more. And as far as things coming up this week, there is kind of the big movie, or the most notable movie this week, The Society of Ungentlemanly Warfare. I'm hoping to check this movie out. Not 100% sure. It looks like a fun kind of. I like
action flick.
What's the Guy Ritchie's the director, and I just kind of like his style. Like it's always kind of like quick dialogue, and he has like a unique approach. And there's like a ton of big name people in this movie. Superman's in this movie, and Reacher's in this movie. Like it looks like it could be fun, kind of a pulpy, simple action movie. And we should also just shout out to, I know Sam is a card carrying Swiftie, so we should mention that Taylor Swift has a new CD coming out, and she's like the most influential entertainer in the world.
Yeah, I've been tearing down my calendar rings, the paper chain calendar. So counting down the days.
So that you'll be ready to jam. So we'll probably.
So I'll be unavailable on that day. So I'll just be.
I'm sure next week maybe we'll both have a chance to listen to the album and just give our thoughts. Not necessarily, it's not European metal, so it's not like in my wheelhouse. But hey, I can appreciate that she's a good songwriter. So there's some interesting stuff coming out this week. But one of the things that you don't even have to wait till later this week, you can get it right now, is the final segment of this podcast, Things We Like That You Should Like Too. So this is my week. Last time I had a chance to do this, I maybe went a little adjacent to popular culture and shared about like an indie, unknown German progressive thrash power metal band. So
subculture.
Yeah. So I didn't want people to think that I'm not aware of like popular culture. I'm the host of the Pop Culture Podcast. So I thought I would share something else that I like, cultural, and that is kind of Victorian literature from the 1800s. It's also one of my
the foundation of which all pop culture is seated on.
The birth of pop culture, and share one of my favorite authors, and that is Mr. Anthony Trollope, who isn't as well known, although like today, like we know like Dickens, like we know some of these like well known like Victorian era authors, but Trollope is great, and he actually was Dickens is probably my favorite non-Tolkien author that I've read, and like Trollope was I was so sad when I finished all the Dickens books. And then I found Trollope, which is very similar to Dickens, a very prolific author. I think he wrote like 47 novels, which by my count, I have now read 14 of them, which I think makes the author I've read more of than any other author, simply because he has a lot to read. But they're just good. Obviously, there's a cultural divide. It's not as accessible as even like a Dickens. Like these are very long books with a lot of subplots, and it's very like Victorian, and you have all these like different on different types of people and their drama and their romance, and he was like very into politics. Like I think he was like a failed politician, so his novels have a lot of like political maneuvering, but it's just he's very good at like characters and like dealing with sort of moral issues and like choices, and I don't think he was like a believer necessarily. Like I think he was culturally there's a lot of religious stuff and like clergy in his books, but hey. If you want to, dive into some of the great, the heritage of pop culture and go back to the 1800s and read some like 1,300-page novels, check out Anthony Trollope. Definitely gets my recommendation. Are you intrigued by? Is this going to be added to?
Yeah, well, there's some things that I appreciate from the Victorian England period, so I might have to give old Tony a shot. If I were to read one, where should a guy start?
Well, you see,
Do you have what's an entry point into old Tony Trollope?
so his most famous, he has two like sets. Like he basically created like a fantasy, not a fantasy, like a secondary world. Like it's basically England, but it's his own sort of territory that he made up, and there's all these characters. And he has two series, the Barchestershire Chronicles, which is like I think a series of 6 books, which sort of focuses on like the rural and like the clergy, and like the books are all like distinct stories with the characters overlap. And then he has like the Palliser novels series, which I've read, which is like sort of like the city of that, and there's like the politics, and there's like some overlap from both of them. But those are his most like popular, although they are like a series. You can read them out of order, but like there's
All right.
overlapping. You get attached to them. I won't lie, I got a little like teary when I finished these. It's like I've read like 12 novels of these characters. Like I feel like I know them. But I will say, and again, I won't belong it, but like there is something soothing and like I think healthy about reading old literature.
Yeah.
That like so much of like today's I think books and stuff is like inspired by television. It's like very brisk, and like every chapter is a page turner, and it's all like,
Yeah.
it's just like read one more, and it's very much like because we're used to TV doing that like some of these old novels they just take their time, and like they have all these subplots that aren't even all that connected. Like it's more just like, hey, live with these characters, like, get to know them and their stuff, and it's not trying to just like, not that they're not entertaining, but like
Yeah.
it's just like let's just sort of look at human nature
The
and
pace is a bit
without
slower.
some of the gimmicks and stuff that it's like a good counterbalance to just like the
Good. Well, I'm all for that. So
we're all,
yeah.
but hopefully also a counterbalance to just all the the various ideologies and stuff going on in culture today is this podcast as we let's look at, hey, how can Christians be angry at the right things and just engage with what's going on. So we thank you guys for joining us every week. Again, make sure tell your friends, tell your enemies. If you haven't done so, go over and give us a little 5-star review. That just helps our podcast grow. But most of all, we hope you'll join us next week, every Thursday, for new episodes. So we hope we will see you then for more conversations on faith and pop culture.